Okay, I think we're live. Hey, all right, we already got some people here waiting before we even started. Ellen, Bill, and Alice, thank you guys so much for being here. This is awesome. Hopefully you guys are seeing me. Oh, and Ruth is here as well. So cool. Yeah, my software is not showing me how many people are here today for some reason, but I'm just going to trust that it's working, and Ruth's comment makes me think it is, so feel free to, as always, guys, I say this at the beginning of every stream, but if you want to interact, you can use the chat bar that's over to the right of the video screen. Hey, Kim, how you doing? So good to see you. Here's a true story for those of you guys who are here early. We'll give a couple minutes for people to jump on. Hey, Jessica, how's it going? This is a true story. Right before I started the stream, I looked at my teeth and saw that there was a bunch of food in there. And so I ran into my daughter's bathroom, which is the bathroom closest to the room that I'm using as an office during shelter in place, and used my daughter's toothbrush to clean a variety of, Thai food out of my teeth that was still stuck in there. So that's a little bonus story just for you guys who are here on time. Hey, Augustina and Jill, how's it going? Joey, so cool to see all you guys here. Yeah, you're here early, you get the good stuff. You get to hear about, me using my daughter's light up toothbrush to clean food out of my teeth, literally seconds before the stream starts. These are the behind the scenes things that the big celebrities don't tell you about when they're doing their live streams. But we're all about being real here. Okay, let's jump in. I'm sure we'll have some people kind of joining us as we go. But as usual, these hermeneutics ones that we've been doing for the last few videos typically take a little longer than some of the more kind of systematic theology oriented ones. So we're going to try to jump right in and be as quick as we can. This is part 4 of a multi-part series we've been doing on how to read and interpret the Bible well. This will be the second to last one. So next week, we're going to finish up. And so I hope you guys have been enjoying it. And as of next week, I'll have an announcement about kind of what the next series we're going to be going through is. We're definitely going to change gears. Alice wants to know if I'm going to get my daughter a new toothbrush. Absolutely not. I will rinse that sucker off and she'll use it tomorrow. We'll see. My wife is watching the stream. She might have an opinion. So yeah, next week I'll let you guys know what our next series is going to be about. But today we're going to continue doing what we've been doing. And the way we've kind of been walking through these is each week we're covering one big picture generalized principle of interpretation, something that you can use no matter what part of the Bible you're reading. And then we've spent some time going through a genre or two. Hold on, guys. Give me a second here. Something's going on with my stream. I'm going to see if I can get it. Hey, Joe's here. Awesome. Give me just a second here. Okay, I think we're better now. Sorry about that. All right. So as I was saying, we cover a couple of genres. This week, we're going to be covering 2 big genres again. We're going to be talking about Old Testament narratives and law codes. And these are big ones, things we, just like last week when we talked about epistles and wisdom literature, we frankly don't have the kind of time necessary to really do these justice. We're going to do our best in an hour. And so today's big picture thing that we're talking about is how to tell the difference between descriptive and prescriptive texts. Last week when we talked about macro versus micro priority in hermeneutics, I said that was the most important thing that I'd be talking about in this entire series. And I still believe that's true, but this is probably a very close second to that. This is one of those things that once you understand it, depending on how you're wired, it can be just an absolutely massive relief as far as questions you might have had about how the Bible works or arguments against the Bible that you've heard people make. So this is an absolutely huge one. And it's very, very simple to understand. Descriptive and prescriptive texts in the Bible are exactly what they sound like. Descriptive texts are texts that describe something, and prescriptive texts are texts that tell you to do something. So a descriptive text is what happened, and a prescriptive text is what you need to do. So hopefully that difference makes sense. It's really that simple. The difficulty comes in us assuming that everything in the Bible is prescriptive. We, understandably, come to the Bible kind of expecting to be told how to live our lives. And the Bible is certainly there to do that. A lot of the texts do that in a very direct way. But many, many parts of the text are stories that are reporting true events that really happened, but they're not telling you that you should imitate what you're reading necessarily. In fact, many of the stories are exactly the opposite. They're telling you horrible stories about brutal, terrible things that happened that you are not meant to imitate at all. And so, again, as Christians, one of the biggest challenges we face is we expect the entire Bible to speak to us in the same way, that every book and every genre is going to give us the exact same type of message in the exact same format. And so we want to just be given like a nice, clean, here's the moral of the story, here's what you're supposed to do. And a huge percentage of the Bible just doesn't work like that. It's going to tell you a story, and the story will be true, but it will not necessarily be something you should imitate or something that you want to do. And the reason why this matters is because there's a kind of opposition to the Bible that comes up really frequently. Many of you have probably heard it. It's what I talked about in the description of this video, that basically says, Christians say they're all about love and peace and faith and all this stuff. But if you read the Bible, it's like violent and horrible. And it's full of things like murder and incest and rape and every other like evil thing you could imagine. So why would you want to be a part of a religion with such a horrible book? And the easiest answer is, well, the Bible's full of true stories about horrible things that happened. But the Bible's not telling you an endorsement of those things necessarily. Let me give you kind of a common example. This is an example, common in terms of something that's commonly misunderstood, unfortunately. And this is from the book of Judges. Apologize if I'm about to ruin some of your favorite Bible characters. This is a guy named Gideon. And this is the story that gets misused all the time. So it starts at Judges chapter 6, verse 36. It says, "Then Gideon said to God, 'If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said.' And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said, 'Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew.' And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew." So, people have frequently taken this story to be a great example of how we can verify whether or not something is God's will. Hey, Gideon gave God a test and said, hey, if this is really your will, if you really want me to be the one to save Israel, then do this very specific supernatural thing that I'm asking you to do. And God did it. So, hey, if you need to test God, lay out a fleece. That's actually a phrase many of you may have heard. And as I've said many times in these videos, if that's something you've said or endorsed before, give yourself a break. We're all here to learn. But it's a phrase within Christianity. People will say, we just got to set out a fleece. And it means, test God if that's really his will for you. The problem is, in very many prescriptive parts of the Bible, you get an explicit command not to test God in this manner. We'll look at just one prominent example of that from Deuteronomy 6. This is a part of the Bible that absolutely is prescriptive. It's a law code, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that says straightforwardly, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, Jesus quotes that passage when he's being tempted by the devil. The devil tells him, hey, do this thing to prove that you are who you say you are. And Jesus says, the Bible says, as it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And so what we find out about that Gideon story is it's not a prescriptive text telling you what to do. It's not giving you a method by which you should test God. It's telling you a story about a time when someone did test God. And if you zoom out and take a macro look at the story that this story is a part of, it makes way more sense. Because Gideon, unfortunately, is not a very brave guy. He's not a very good example in a number of ways. When we meet Gideon, the angel of the Lord comes to tell him that he's been selected by God to protect Israel, and he finds him threshing wheat, which involves throwing wheat up in the air and letting the wind kind of carry away the chaff. He's doing that down in a wine press because he is so afraid of Israel's enemies. So we're introduced to him as somebody who's kind of a coward. And then as the story goes on, when God calls him, he kind of has excuses and he hems and haws and doesn't really want to do it. And that's not uncommon. There's lots of biblical characters who've had stories like that, Moses being one of them. But he demonstrates over and over again that he's kind of a guy with not very much faith. He's kind of fearful. And so when you read it in context, when Gideon tests God not once but twice, you're not supposed to be like, that's what I should do. You're supposed to see, okay, this guy does not really have faith that God is going to do what he said he did. And that actually makes the story become much more beautiful, because it's a story, like many of the stories in the Bible, about God accomplishing something beautiful and incredible in spite of Gideon's, faithlessness and fearfulness. And so when you come to stories, this is kind of the big picture point I'm trying to make. When you come to a story, do not assume that you are being shown something that you should imitate. Now, where this really comes into play is in the kind of the case of the various biblical heroes that we have as Christians. And I put heroes in quotes on purpose, because the Bible has exactly one hero, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Everybody else in the Bible is a realistic, flawed human being, because they're all real human beings, and the Bible's telling you the truth about them. And so because of how we typically read hero stories in the modern West, we expect these characters to be people that we can identify with in every way. And if it's a good guy, he should always be good. And if he's a bad guy, he should always be good. Or bad, sorry. Unfortunately, in the Bible, there are very few characters who are good in every story that we encounter them in. There's just a couple who we don't get any stories about them doing anything horrible. And even those, it doesn't mean they never did anything horrible. It just means we don't have those stories. But guys like David, who's Israel's greatest king, he's a man after God's own heart, but he has multiple wives. He commits adultery and then conspires to have the woman who he had the affair with have her husband killed. All kinds of horrible stuff. His son Solomon is another example I think of all the time. He's this guy who gets this gift of wisdom from God, but by the end of his story, not only does he have hundreds of wives and concubines, but he also has defied literally every single one of the Deuteronomic laws about how kings are supposed to live. So Solomon, not a good guy, even though you think he should be. More nuanced way to look at it would be to say Solomon's not a good guy or a bad guy. He's complex. He's a real person. And so as you're reading the Bible, this is just kind of a subcategory of that same idea of descriptive and prescriptive. When something freaks you out, or when someone comes to you with a challenging story in the Bible and says, this is in the Bible, how can you possibly believe this stuff? Your very first thought should be, okay, is this a descriptive or a prescriptive text? And it doesn't answer every single problem. There are still many passages that are very difficult, and many sections of the Bible that are difficult. But you would be surprised how many times you just go, well, the Bible's telling you a story. It's not endorsing that story. Samson's another example that gets trotted out all the time. You'll see on blogs and stuff, blogs. Welcome to 2010, everybody. You'll see on blogs and stuff, people saying, look at this horrible story that this hero character in the Bible, all the stuff he does, that's awful. You just go, Samson's not a hero. Samson's a mixed bag, man. He's a pretty bad guy. But again, the beautiful good news of this is that all of these characters are imperfect vessels through whom God accomplishes incredible things. And that is, man, so much better news than being delivered story after story about unattainable heroes that you could never aspire to be like. In Christianity, we get story after story about somebody who makes horrible mistakes, and yet God uses them to accomplish his will. So expect characters to be complex. Expect the Bible to tell a bunch of horrible things that really happened, because it's telling you the truth about humanity and human history and God's work in it. And learn to kind of discern, is this a text that's telling me I should do this, or a text that's not? And on that note, that's kind of the perfect segue into the first genre we're going to talk about tonight, because this is the genre where the kind of descriptive, prescriptive difference matters the most. Hey, Taya, I just saw you there. And then somebody named Love Never Fails threw in a bunch of solid emojis. Thank you. Just to remind you guys, you are welcome at any time, if you're watching this live, to jump into that chat, ask questions, make comments. I try to save some time at the end to run through some of your guys' questions and answer them. So don't be shy to do that. Love to hear from you. And if you're watching this later, you can do the same thing in the comments. I check those every day or two, and happy to engage with you that way as well. So the first big genre we're talking about tonight is historical narrative. And it is a big genre. This is the single largest genre in the Bible. More than 40% of the Bible is historical narratives. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, oh, hey, I have a guess about who that is, but I'm not going to make my guess just based on the name. Technically the Gospels, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, are also historical narratives, but they're different enough that they kind of warrant their own discussion. So we're talking now primarily about Old Testament historical narratives. And again, 40% of the Bible is made up of these, and a huge percentage of the Old Testament. And basically, at the simplest level, historical narratives are stories. And in that sense, they're a genre that's very familiar to us. Every culture that we know of tells stories. They tell stories in a huge variety of ways, retelling events from the past to try to teach something to those in the present. The cool thing about the Bible stories is there's kind of that dual layer of history where they're telling you a story. Remember our conversation about context. Story takes place in one historical setting, and it was meant to speak to people in a different historical setting. And that on and on through history, all the way to us. Now, the Hebrew way of telling stories is very different than the way that we tell stories in the Western tradition. And so even though we're familiar with reading stories and will recognize many of the characteristics of Hebrew storytelling, you're going to see a pretty dramatically different style of storytelling, and it can really throw us off. This is particularly true because in the West, when we tell historical stories, when we're trying to tell history, things that really happened, we do it very differently than when we tell fictional stories. And, our historical things tend to be very focused on exact detail. They tend to be very dry and kind of direct. And we tell fiction stories differently than that. In the Hebrew tradition, this is I'm kind of overgeneralizing, but it's a really helpful tip. The Hebrew way of telling stories, even when they're historical, even when they're true, has much more in common with the way that we tell fictional stories. They have devices like characters, plots, settings, tensions and resolves, and the ways that we tend to write stories that are fictional. But when you're reading in the Bible, you're reading historical stories that are told in that way. So here's a few of the kind of devices that are familiar to us on the surface, but work very differently in Hebrew narrative. The first one is characters. Characters are obviously a huge part of any kind of storytelling, and they're huge in the Bible as well. But you're going to find, and those of you who've read the Bible a lot already know this, you get a lot less detail about characters in the Bible than you're used to in modern stories. We very rarely get descriptions of what people look like, what they sound like, not that many details about their life. Basically, you only find out what's relevant to the story. And so here's one kind of key feature. Anytime you find out a detail about someone in the Bible, in a historical narrative, that detail is going to matter. They don't waste pages describing people. So you're not going to find out he was really tall and he was, bald with a big beard and blue eyes. You're not going to get that in the Bible. And if they tell you the way someone looks, that's going to matter later. So you find out David's son Absalom has long hair, and that's foreshadowing some things that are going to happen later in the story. I won't spoil that for you if you haven't read it. The fact that King Saul is very tall and impressive, while David is very small and unimpressive. These kinds of things matter. And if the author goes out of his way to tell you this kind of stuff, pay attention. It's going to come back around and matter later. Characters are often kind of used in combination to either be compared to one another or contrasted. That can happen within the same story or across multiple stories over time and throughout the canon as a whole. So, an example of an immediate story where that happens would be Cain and Abel. You have these kind of good son, bad son, very iconic, easy comparison. You also get people like Joseph and Judah, who are two sons of Jacob, whose name becomes Israel, who, while you're getting this story about Joseph being faithful while he's in slavery in Egypt, you're going to get cut in stories about Judah, who's back where he's supposed to be, but he's doing all this horrible, immoral stuff. And you're supposed to compare these two characters to each other and draw some conclusions. Over time, you also see the same thing happening. By the time in the New Testament, you're introduced to Mary, the mother of Jesus. If you're steeped in Old Testament narrative, she should be reminding you of someone. And that someone, in my opinion, is Hannah, the mother of Samuel from the book of 1 Samuel. And, they both kind of get these miraculous children given to them by God. They both respond in these songs of faith and great statements of faith. And, those parallels are really rich if you explore them and dive in. Another example, which we talked about in church just a few months ago, is Jonah the prophet and the sailors on the boat that he takes. Jonah is this prophet of Israel. He's supposed to be this incredible, have this role where he speaks with God and communicates from God. And yet he gets outperformed ethically and morally by the pagan sailors on the boat that he's using to try to flee from God. So again, these are the things you're supposed to kind of be trying to key into. And with all of this stuff, and this is no exception, there's really no shortcut to kind of getting familiar with it. It just takes time in the text, reading it, becoming familiar with all the stories and all the different characters. Settings are also incredibly significant, but very easy to miss because of cultural distance. And they work similarly to how they do in our fictional stories. Settings are used more than you and I typically think about to clue you in to what's going on. You learn a whole lot about a story right off the bat just from where and when it takes place. So if I'm telling you a story and I say, the year is 1944, Normandy, right? You know what I'm talking about already. You know what kind of story you're getting into. And I could, confuse you by suddenly turning that into like a random science fiction story or something, but I would have to be intentionally subverting your expectations. And the Bible does that too. So, if you're watching a movie or reading a book and it's on Mars, or it's in an old rundown abandoned house, or, it's in a Western town, you know what you're getting into. And the Bible does that too. The problem is we're not familiar with what different types of settings are supposed to communicate. So we miss this stuff quite a bit of the time. An example I used a few weeks ago in a Theology Thursday video is Egypt. Egypt is this kind of iconic place that God brought Israel out of, and a place that you are never, as an Israelite, supposed to go back to. And it comes up over and over in the Old Testament. And Egypt is always supposed to be something that, signals to you, the reader, oh, bad news. If people are going to Egypt, it's bad. You don't go to Egypt if you're a Bible character. And that's why, like we talked about a few weeks ago, in the Gospels, when Jesus and Mary and Joseph have to flee from Judah to go to Egypt in order to find safety from the king of Judah, something's gone terribly wrong in Israel. It's a subversion of the expectations of that setting. So the places really matter. And I'm going to sound like a broken record because I'll probably say this a bunch of times, but the only way to get used to this is to read and reread these stories and become familiar with what types of things happen in different places. So, another example is the wilderness. The wilderness is the place where Israel wanders for 40 years. And so in the Gospels, when Jesus is suddenly in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by Satan, you're supposed to see a connection. Gardens are another thing. All kinds of things happen in gardens that are supposed to evoke Eden, either positively or negatively, because it could be evoking the failure of Adam and Eve or the goal toward which God is bringing history of returning things back to that garden-like situation. So become familiar with settings. Try and pay attention to when things start to sound familiar. You might be reading along in the Old Testament and be like, hey, there's a whole lot of things have happened under trees. Let me look back and kind of think back through the stories of what happened under trees. Or, man, how many times have we been at the entrance of someone's tent? What could that mean? And I'm not going to spoil it for you. I'm just going to tell you, pay attention to these things and start to see what comes out. Really exciting stuff, if you're a nerd. Plot works very similarly to the way that we do plots. The biggest difference is that plot pacing is incredibly fast. Plot, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, just means kind of the cause and effect ordering of a story. It's, what happens to bring the characters from A to B? What's the cause and effect that's moving the story along logically? And they move incredibly quickly sometimes in the Bible. Sometimes you'll jump chronologically by hundreds of years in just a couple of pages. But the key with plot in the Bible is that they, I talked about this with a previous genre, but plots in narratives nest. So it's like Russian nesting dolls. And again, our plots do this as well. You have subplots, and those plots have subplots, and all of them are tying back to the big plot. And it can be really easy to lose track of. We're really good at it when we're watching complicated movies or reading novels. But with the Bible, because we, if we're being diligent, we're just reading a little bit every day, it can be really hard to remember how things are connected back up the ladder to the original plot. And so one example of this, we'll just do the example we've been talking about. So Joseph is one of the sons of Israel. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ends up, going through all these different ups and downs in Egypt. And his story kind of makes up the last chunk of the book of Genesis. And his story by itself is absolutely incredible. But the story of Joseph is part of the story of Israel, Jacob. And the story of Jacob is ultimately part of the story of Abraham, which started all the way back in Genesis 12 with God promising Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and I'm going to bless that son, and from his line, there's going to be an entire nation, and I'm going to use that nation to bless all the nations of earth. So by the time you have Joseph in the middle of a famine in Egypt, coming up with the plan that is necessary to save all of the nations of earth, that's the way it's described. People from the entire known world come to Egypt to get saved from this famine. You're not just supposed to see, hey, God is really using Joseph here. You're supposed to see, man, God is already starting to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham literally like 30 chapters ago, back in Genesis 12. And so all of that, and this is the key, all of it ultimately is going to fold back into the meta-narrative of all of Scripture, which goes from the very beginning of Genesis to the very end of Revelation. And it's all the story of a good God who is doing what's necessary to reconcile his rebellious creation back to himself. And he does it using rebellious creatures. So you have this big overarching meta-narrative, and every story that you read is going to be a part of a series of kind of nested subplots that all contribute to that big story. And I cannot tell you, I know I'm getting all excited and all nerdy about it, but seriously, nothing has transformed my view of the Bible more than getting this. I had years and years of my life where I read the Bible kind of haphazardly, a little bit at a time. Maybe I'd read it every night for a while, but it wasn't until I started reading the entire book, which was 8 or 9 years ago. I'm going to read the whole Bible every year. And I started to see the big picture of the entire story, how it's one unified story with one point, and all of these things in it contribute to it. And man, you start to see the Bible that way, the Bible will absolutely come alive for you. So when you're reading historical narratives, read these individual stories. They're beautiful and interesting in themselves. There's just tons of variety of interesting stories. But really, as you're going, train yourself to see what is it, how does this story contribute overall to the meta-narrative that it's a part of? All right, I'm talking too much about that. Dialogue is also super important. The closest you're going to get to kind of like a direct explanation of the point of a story is usually going to come in dialogue. So again, if we're talking about, Joseph, we jump to the very end of Genesis 50. At the very end of the story, you get Joseph finally he confronts his brothers who sold him into slavery all those years ago. They all end up moving to Egypt to be safe with him. That goes south later, but at the time it's a good thing. And then their father, Jacob, also called Israel, he dies, and they're worried that now that dad's dead, Joseph is going to kill us because he has all this influence in Egypt. So they come to him and fall down before him, which, by the way, is its own reference back to something that happened 13 chapters ago when Joseph had a dream that his brothers would all bow to him. But that's a side note. And so they basically say, hey, we'll be your servants, don't hurt us. Verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So Joseph, in a sense, tells us as the readers, this is the point here, is that, hey, look, I'm not going to judge, I'm not going to attack you, I'm not going to kill you. God worked his will even in the midst of your evil action. And so that kind of dialogue moment gives you the closest peek to the moral of the story that you're going to get in that directive a way. Another example, actually, I wasn't even planning to talk about this, but right after this, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph dying, and it says, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So the end of the story is a dialogue section where Joseph says, God's going to visit you, and you're going to carry my bones out of here. Genesis ends. What's the next book? Exodus, the story of God rescuing his people from Egypt. So you can see two examples there of dialogue concluding one story and then foreshadowing the next one. So all that to say, just when people are speaking in these narratives, pay attention to what they're saying. Also look at repetition and pay attention to that. When details are repeated over and over again, the author is signaling you, this is important, key into this. Okay, so here's the key to interpreting narrative. I won't necessarily read everything that's on that slide, but let me just say it like this. We want it to give us a really straightforward, direct teaching, and it very rarely does that. The authors are usually not going to tell you, and when Abraham decided to have a baby with Hagar instead of waiting for God's promise, that was a bad thing to do. They won't tell you that. The goal is for you to read these stories, absorb them, and meditate on them. They're not moralistic tales. They don't have a simple, kind of easy to digest meaning. They're layered, and you're meant to watch and learn by seeing the effects and consequences of people's actions. So another great example would be, you're not going to ever in Old Testament narratives find a straightforward, I shouldn't say not ever, but you're rarely going to find a straightforward denunciation of polygamy in Old Testament narrative. So when a character like David takes multiple wives, or a character like Solomon takes multiple wives, the narrator's not just going to cut in and be like, and that was bad, he shouldn't have done that. No, what you have to do is read and watch what happens as a result. And so just in that example alone, I would encourage you, read stories where biblical characters are polygamous and watch whether it goes well for them or not. A famous example is David and Bathsheba, where David commits adultery and then has the woman's husband murdered. That you get pretty close because the prophet Nathan comes in and condemns what David did. But to really see the ramifications of that sin, you have to read the rest of the story and watch the impact on David's family for generations and on the entire nation of Israel. So you want to look for illustrations of principles rather than the principles being stated directly themselves. And this is where that descriptive versus prescriptive stuff really matters, because you're going to see characters behave badly, and you don't learn a lesson from the author telling you directly what you should learn. You learn a lesson by seeing, what does this type of behavior result in? And is that what I want for my life? So the biggest thing you can do to interpret narratives well is read them. Read them well. Learn to read them like stories. They read more like stories than history, even though they're historical and they're true. And learn to see how they fit together. Learn to see how every story contributes in large ways and small ways to that big picture narrative that the entire Bible is telling us. You want to learn to kind of read everything back into that big narrative and say, how does this contribute to the story of God reconciling all things? Now, the next genre that we're going to talk about is chosen on purpose to go with this one because it occurs within historical narratives. And these are the law codes of the Old Testament. Very difficult genre for modern Christians. Maybe the hardest, if not the hardest, then one of the hardest for sure. And very few Christians have like a theological comfort level with the law sections of the Old Testament. I can imagine many of you guys who are watching live right now would say that, if I were to ask you, how comfortable do you feel with your understanding of how you're supposed to relate to the Old Testament law? I would guess, just, based on Christians I've talked to over the years, not many of you would feel super comfortable. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit. I want to talk about kind of how they work and how to understand them. And then I'll give you kind of my take on how we as Christians are supposed to relate to them, because that's really, where the rubber meets the road for us. Now, I put them with historical narratives because it is imperative that we read these law sections of the Bible, things like Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and parts of Numbers. You have to read them in the context that they're in, as part of historical narratives. It's very easy to think of the laws as things that are just kind of like spoken from the void timelessly, but they are very much bound within the narratives that they're a part of, and you can't understand them outside of where they belong. So when you get the law codes, here's the really simple short version. Israel has been a nation of slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. They've been suffering under, Egyptian slavery, but also subject to Egyptian culture and religion for hundreds of years. They have not governed themselves as a nation. God rescues them from Egypt, brings them out into the wilderness, and they are about to become the distinct people of God, sent into the promised land with the job of showing the rest of the world what God is like. And Israel, at this point in history, could not be less adequately prepared for a task. Like it would be impossible to imagine a worse situation, right? They were just slaves, like a month ago, and now they're supposed to be this brand new nation. And so the law codes were given to Israel by God as a gift to guide them into this task of becoming a nation that would represent God to the rest of the nations. It's a gift of God to teach a nation of former slaves how to be God's people. That's what the law is for. It's about how to have, an immediate and intimate relationship with a holy God when you're not a holy people, and it's how to relate to the nations around you. It's also important to realize we don't have like an exhaustive law code that's meant to cover every single circumstance. What we have are these kind of something more like a constitution than a real law book. It's paradigmatic. It's meant to set the paradigm. These are example situations from which you could extrapolate how to handle similar situations. So we don't necessarily have to walk through this, but these are the kind of sections of the law in the Old Testament. You have the 10 words, which is what I like to call the 10 commandments. It helps us disentangle from some of our expectations of them. And the book of the covenant, this is what happens right after Egypt. Then you have all the laws about how to build the tabernacle and how to relate to the tabernacle. That's an incredible section. It's frankly difficult to read. A lot of people get very bogged down when they hit that section of Exodus because it's like, all the details of all of the pillars and the footings for the pillars and all of the different materials that go over the tabernacle. And it can be difficult to read. But it's this beautiful moment where God is telling Israel, here is how I'm going to dwell in the midst of you, even though you are rebellious and disobedient and evil, and I'm a holy God. I want to dwell among you, so this is how we're going to do it. It's also, I'm not going to get into this, but if you read the sections of how the tabernacle is supposed to be built, and you read Genesis 1 and the creation story, you can see that what's meant to be communicated here, partly, is that the tabernacle is a mini mobile tent version of the Garden of Eden. So you can go, check that on your own. Super cool, though. Next, you have the Levitical laws. These are the laws that have to do with the priesthood and sacrifices and atonement. Ultimately, again, this is about Israel living with Yahweh as a holy people, even though they're not holy. And so you have systems for atonement for sins that people commit and mistakes that they make. And then finally, you have Deuteronomy, which is a series of speeches that Moses gives right before the people of Israel enter the promised land. So this is the generation after the generation that was rescued from Egypt. And right before they go into the promised land, he's going to kind of exposit and recapitulate the laws to that generation. And so all of these are incredibly important part of the story of God and humanity. And that's why the way I said that was intentional. It's part of the story. And so you have to see it. Don't just see them as kind of this separate thing that's just dropped right into the middle of the Bible. They happen with this people at this time for a purpose. Here are a couple of guiding principles when you're reading law texts, and these are all sort of corrective. Because I think most of us, when we read these as modern Christians, we think we're reading these incredibly restrictive and difficult rules that a person had to follow in order to be a good Israelite. And that's just not really the case. The first thing is that the law was meant as a response to salvation, not something that you did to get salvation. It's not a precondition for salvation. It's a response to salvation. And when I say salvation, what I mean is God's rescue. So if you are an Israelite, God has already saved you from Egypt. That's why you're an Israelite, because God chose you and God rescued you from out of Egypt. So the law is given as something to show an already rescued people how to be God's people. It's not something you do in order to get rescued. The only reason you're standing there at the foot of Sinai is because God already rescued you. And that kind of cart and horse will change your understanding of the law and the Old Testament in general hugely. I mean, God goes out of his way to say that. He says, look, let's just, if you look at what God says right before he starts the 10 Commandments, the first thing he says is, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So God starts the law codes by saying, I already rescued you, so here's how I want you to live. It's not something in order to get yourself rescued. It's something for people who've already been rescued. And the second thing is that it's less of an imposition of regulations and duties, and more of an expression of covenant relationship. God is expressing his love for Israel in his rescue and provision for them, and says, I'll be your God, I'll be with you, I'm going to give you the promised land, I'm going to do all these things that I promised your forefathers. This is what I want you to do in return for your side of the relationship. So it's less about like, hey, make sure you don't break these rules, and more about this is how you express your faithfulness to me in relationship. The third one, and this is one that gets missed all the time, is that the law is designed to make Israel the kind of nation that they need to be in order to accomplish God's mission for them. God wants Israel to represent him before the rest of the nations. And in order for them to do that accurately, in order for the other nations to look at Israel and say, that's what God is like, this is the type of things that they need to do and not do. So it's very missional in that sense. And again, we can actually jump over and look at what I'm talking about here. It's I think it's the very previous chapter, 19. Oh, too far. Yeah, right here. Now therefore, this is Exodus 19, verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. Here's the key. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so what does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? Well, priests are the ones who, what's the word I'm looking for? Who relate God to humanity and vice versa. They're the mediators of relationship between God and humanity. And so God says, my intention for all of Israel is that you will be nationally a priest. You will be a kingdom whose job it is to mediate between me and the rest of the nations. And by the way, talk about meta-narrative. That's what God promised Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12. He says, hey, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you tons of offspring, a mighty nation, and through your family, I'm going to bless all the families of earth. That's the goal. And so a huge part of the intention of the law that we miss out on when we read it is God is shaping his people to be a people who can actually accomplish that. And then finally, and this one, again, is not intuitive to modern Western people, but the law is not, when you're a Christian in the modern world, it's easy to think of the law as like this burdensome, difficult, horrible thing that nobody would ever want to do. But the Israelites saw the law as a privilege and a blessing and a gift. Moses in the Old Testament describes the Torah as this privilege and beautiful thing that if other nations see it, they'll be jealous of it because of how good and how clear it is. Let's look at this real quick. Hold on. Deuteronomy 4. Moses says, see, I have taught you statutes and rules, the law, as Yahweh my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, meaning all the other nations. So you see that intention there already. Then he says, who, when they hear these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as Yahweh our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules that are so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? So you can see the way that they saw the law was very different than the way we typically do. They're not going like, oh my gosh, I got to do all this stuff. Moses goes, no, keep these commands, because when they see the tabernacle, they'll be like, look how near their God is to them. He's there when they call on him. And when they see the law, they'll say, look at this wise law. Look how good this God must be. The law was so good that if it were kept rightly, the other ancient Near Eastern nations around Israel would look at Israel and think, wow, that is the kind of God that I want to serve. And so it's a privilege, not a horrible duty that they had to, follow against their will. So try to read it that way. Read it in its historical context. Read it positively. Read it as something that's a gift in response to a salvation that Israel already had from Egypt. And here's where I want to get into some theology, and I want to give a caveat before any of this that this is to some extent controversial material. It's not horribly controversial, but there are a variety of opinions about exactly how Christians are supposed to relate to the Old Testament. I'm going to tell you what I think and kind of walk you through some verses that show why. But I want to get into the question that really matters when it comes to the law, which is, how are we as Christians supposed to relate to it? Because when you read it, you're probably asking the natural question most of the time, which is, you're reading these law codes and you're going like, okay, but am I supposed to do these or not? And I wish if I was with you all in person, I'd say, raise your hand if you've ever read Old Testament law and asked, am I supposed to do this? Because that seems like a very obvious question. And because some stuff kind of makes sense. You're like, yeah, no idols, I got that. Honor my parents. The 10 Commandments seem good. But then all of a sudden it's like, but I eat shrimp and I eat bacon and I wear clothes with 2 types of material sewn into them. And again, you've probably noticed online or in person that opponents of Christianity will often bring that up as an inconsistency. You say you believe in the Bible, but I see you eating some bacon wrapped shrimp over there, so you're not following all of it. And so the question comes, which parts of it, if any, and why? Some stuff makes sense to follow, some stuff doesn't. And so I want to jump straight to something that Jesus says about the law that I think is kind of the interpretive paradigm setter for us. It's early in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, this is a powerful verse and very misunderstood in my opinion. Matthew 5:17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, many people take these verses to mean that the law still stands because Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law. The problem is these 2 words, abolish and fulfill, are not opposites. It's not one word that means to end something and one word that means to continue it. They're 2 different words that both mean different types of endings. Hopefully that makes sense. So Jesus doesn't say, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to continue the law. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And abolishing and fulfilling are 2 different ways that something can come to an end. And so in Greek, this is even more clear because the Greek word katalusai, which gets translated as abolish, is even harsher than it sounds in English. It means like to tear down, destroy, or demolish something. And the second word, the Greek word plerosai, is the same word that gets used when an Old Testament prophecy gets fulfilled. It means to finish something, to complete something, to bring something to the point of accomplishment. So what Jesus is saying is not, I didn't come to end it, I came to continue it. He's saying, I didn't come to destroy it or rip it apart like it was something bad. I came to slam dunk it. I came to finish it. I came to accomplish it. Bring it to an end, but in a positive way. Because you see, God's not looking down before the beginning of the New Testament thinking like, oh man, this whole Israel plan didn't work. I thought Israel could be a light to all the nations, but it looks like that's not panning out. So I'll do something completely different. I'll throw Jesus in there and maybe that'll work. No, the plan from the beginning was for Israel to be a light to the nations. And when Jesus comes and does what he does, Jesus is the faithful Israelite. Jesus is Israel being a light to the nations, bringing salvation and blessing to all the nations. The metaphor I usually think about is it's as if Jesus said, I didn't come to throw away the meal, I came to eat the meal. You see how that works? I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. So here's what that means. We'll let Paul, because he's normally a little bit more direct, we'll let Paul help us out here. Paul in Romans 10:4 says, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And once again, the Greek is really important here because Paul is being intentional and very specific with his word choice. When he says end, it's not katalusai. It's not that word that means smash or destroy. It's also not plerosai. It's the word telos, which is a beautiful and significant Greek word that means goal or purpose or maturity. So he says Christ is the goal, the purpose, the completion of the law to everyone who believes. It's about something being brought to the ends for which it was created. So I hope that makes sense. I know we're getting into some theological deep waters here. But what he means is that Jesus did what the law was supposed to do. He finished its purpose. What he means is that the law of Moses reached the goal for which it was made, and therefore it is no longer necessary. Not because it's been destroyed, or because it's been deemed useless, but because it did the thing that it was supposed to do in and through Jesus. I hope that makes sense because we're going to keep cruising, because that doesn't mean that we just get to like say, all right, then we don't have to worry about it at all. It's actually much more complex than that. Jesus, much later in the Gospel of Matthew 22, starting at 34, he's getting questioned by Pharisees and teachers of the law. It says, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So Jesus is asked, what's the most important commandment? What's the great commandment? And he gives two commandments into which all of the other ones collapse. And in fact, if you read the Ten Commandments, you'll find that approximately the first half really are covered by love the Lord your God with everything in you. And the second half are covered by love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus says all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So Jesus comes and presents a new law for his followers that's not less than the Old Testament law. It's actually more. It's uncovering the intended purpose behind all of those laws. And you see this most clearly in the Sermon on the Mount. You have Jesus very dramatically, very profoundly uncovering the kind of underlying purpose behind laws that had been followed by Israel in the past. So, you're not supposed to murder according to the Sinaitic covenant, but you can murder someone and still not, or you can not murder someone while still not loving them, right? So to love your neighbor means more than just don't murder them. It means you won't even hate them in your heart. And you can avoid adultery without loving someone. But if you really love them, Jesus says, it will lead you not even to lust after them. So Jesus reveals both in his teaching and his behavior what the true goal of human behavior always is and was. The law was something pointing forward to that, and Jesus comes and fulfills it and teaches us, this is now what I desire from my followers. And it's something that the New Testament calls the law of love. The New Testament authors describe it a bunch of times. Here's just one more example from one of my favorite New Testament epistles, Paul's letter to the Galatians. Paul says, Galatians 5:13, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word. Hear how similar that sounds? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so Paul is saying, you're not freed from the law just to go do whatever you want. No, you are free now to love as Christ loved. And that is a higher calling, not a lower calling. So at the end of the day, if the question is, do you have to keep the Ten Commandments? The answer is no and yes. And the nuance of why it's no and yes is incredibly important. See, we are not under the Sinai covenant that you read about in Exodus chapter 20. That was a covenant for Israel at a particular time in history. I'm not an Israelite, so it was never for me. But even if I was, it was for Israel at that time, and now it's been fulfilled entirely by Christ. So no, we're not obligated to follow those 10 words as a part of that covenant any more than we're obligated to not eat shrimp or bacon. But we are under the new law of love for God and for neighbor. And under that law, we don't just obey the 10 Commandments, we try to obey the greater intentions that lie behind them. So we do follow and obey the 10 Commandments, but not because of the covenant that's made in Exodus 20, because what Jesus commands us to do includes and expands upon those 10 Commandments. So when you read those commandments, you are seeing an early foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to come and later fully reveal. So when Jesus teaches us love God and love others, man, that is going to include and subsume whole portions of the Old Testament law and draw out even greater, heavier, more beautiful implications for us as New Testament believers. But we don't follow because of what's written in Exodus. We follow because of what Jesus told us to do after he fulfilled all of those laws. Now, to be totally frank, that's very complicated, and I went through it really quickly. So if your head is spinning, no worries. I'd be happy to talk to you about it more. be happy to jump on a Zoom call with anybody who'd want to go deeper on that or something. Or you can always watch this later, slow it down. And again, this is, there are other ways of interpreting how Christians are supposed to relate to the law. That's just the way I look at it. And the way, not just me, a huge number of scholars who I've been influenced by. And so I encourage you, dig into that and see if it rings true with what you find in the scriptures. The last point I want to make, and then we'll call it, start thinking about questions you might have, because we still got five minutes or so, is that this is the exact same slide that I put about the law at Sinai. And it all applies to the law of love as well. So what Christians are called to do, to love God and love neighbor, all of those things I said about the law that Israel had apply to us as well. These laws and commandments of Jesus are things that we are called to in response to salvation. They are not a prerequisite for us to get salvation. So you don't do this stuff so that God will save you. You do it because God already has saved you. You are like the Israelite who's already been rescued from Egypt and is being given this law at Sinai. You're a Christian because God saved you through Jesus Christ. And so the things we do in response to a salvation we already have, not so that we can get salvation. Second, they're an expression of our relationship with Jesus. They're not a way to get something out of him. This is us expressing covenant faithfulness to our King. They're also the means by which Jesus is accomplishing his mission. It's not just like, do all this stuff so that you don't upset me. This is the kind of stuff you do in order to accomplish my will on earth. And for us, that's expressed in the Great Commission, where we go and make disciples of all nations. And then finally, similarly, it's a unique and beautiful privilege. This is a good and beautiful thing for us to have this clearly articulated teaching, particularly in places like the Sermon on the Mount and the writings of Paul, about what is expected of people who've been rescued by Jesus. So I hope that's encouraging to you. Like I said, I'm sure there are some heads that are spinning. That's totally fine. Engage with me. Let's talk either now or later. And I hope it's helpful and encouraging to you. Now, feel free to jump in and ask some questions. This book, this is also, I don't know how long ago this comment came in, but it says this is also discussed in the book, The Jesus Creed. Yeah, that's a great point, Alice. The Jesus Creed by Scott McKnight. Fantastic book. And a lot of the same stuff is talked about. He's an example of one of several scholars who have influenced me in a really big way in this area. So great recommendation. He also has a book called, The King Jesus Gospel. That is really incredible, if I got the title right. Feel free to jump in with questions. I'll let you guys know while I'm waiting for questions. Thank you, Ellen. I appreciate you saying that. Ellen says it's very encouraging. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll let you guys know next week will be the last hermeneutics week. We're going to cover some kind of, our first thing will be about how to apply the text to our lives in a general way. And then we're going to finish up with our two kind of final genres, which are two big ones. We're going to talk about the prophetic books and about apocalyptic literature, specifically the book of Revelation. So if you have always been freaked out by the book of Revelation, we're going to spend a lot of time next week talking about it because it's one of my favorites. And I think it's not meant to scare you, it's meant to give you hope. And so we'll talk about that next week as well. And then following that, we're going to start a new series. And next week, I'll tell you guys what that's going to be. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'll hang around just a couple more minutes in case anybody has questions. I'm going to throw this comment up just because look at the density of emojis. I'm trying to understand what that series of emojis. It's a computer, and then it's a couple of cell phones, and a play button. Yeah, I'm doing my best, but I don't think I'm following it. All right, you guys. If there are no other questions, then we'll call it there. We can finish 1 whole minute early. Like I've said every week, I so greatly appreciate you guys all being here with me live. You guys make it so much more enjoyable and entertaining for me than when I was just recording them. So thank you so much. Please come back next week. Love to see you guys here live. And until then, God bless you. I hope you guys hang in there. I know this has been a whole lot longer than any of us thought it would be. But man, hopefully just, something like this that gives you an opportunity to engage your mind, leaves you feeling a little more hopeful and encouraged. So thanks so much, you guys. Love and appreciate you all. See you all next week.